Welcome to the Joy of Cruising podcast with your host, award-winning author Paul C. Thornton, a weekly conversation with the amazing cruisers featured in the Joy of Cruising trilogy, comprised of The Joy of Cruising, Cruising Interrupted, and new release, The Joy of Cruising Again. Each book is a compilation of features about cruisers and cruise and travel personalities from around the world. It's the next best thing to cruising, hearing about cruising from the unique and diverse perspectives of Paul's amazing guests.
Hello, passionate cruisers. This is Paul, and this week I am delighted to welcome to the Joy of Cruising podcast Iris MacBeath, creator of the blog Life of Iris. Iris is a longtime staff member for a major cruise line, most recently as a media manager. I wrote the story of Life of Iris in the just-released The Joy of Cruising Again, in a section called Shiplife, which followed the career of 4 past and present crew, staff, and officers from 3 different cruise lines. In the community that comprises onboard life, Iris is a dual member. First, not only is she a longtime crew member on various ships. Before assuming her role as media manager, Iris worked in a series of youth activities positions. Secondly, Iris is what is known in cruise ship parlance as a traveling spouse or a spouse on board, which is a term used by her cruise line. Specifically, Iris's husband, Stuart, is a ship officer, and Iris has lived on the ship with him for over 400 days. Those distinct vantage points afford Iris a unique perspective of onboard life, and she chronicles that on her blog, Life of Iris. Life of Iris was conceived in early 2020 as a way for Iris to document her reflections as a spouse on board on the Grand World Voyage, on which her husband Stuart, a first engineering officer, was assigned. Iris said, "I wanted to keep track of what we were up to, basically because going around the world is pretty cool." Iris did launch Life of Iris prior to boarding the World Cruise. However, little did Iris know that in the ensuing 2 years, her cruising career would be directly impacted by the 2 greatest global crises of the century. Welcome, Iris, to the Joy of Cruising podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Good to see you again. How you doing?
I'm doing good. Yeah, it's a nice fall day in Vermont right now. Everything's good.
Good. Well, before we discuss your noteworthy cruising career, tell our listeners about yourself. Where you're from, growing up, where you live, your family, whatever you would like to share.
So my name is Iris. I'm from Vermont in the United States. I grew up here. I went to college here. And then after college is when I decided to go explore the world. I know we're going to talk about that a little bit more as the podcast goes on. And I live in Vermont, but my husband is from Scotland. And we also stay in Scotland for part of the year. So we'll go over there for a month or 2 at a time, depending on life and contracts and everything. So, I started cruising when I was 8 years old. My mom took me on my first cruise and I fell in love with it then, and I've been cruising ever since.
So you're one of those, I like to say it's about 90% who got hooked immediately.
I was immediately hooked. Yes. Yeah. I was, the first cruise was on a now many years defunct cruise line called Premier Cruises, which was the big red boat thing.
Oh yeah. That's Premier. Disney. That's the precursor to Disney.
It was.
Yeah.
Exactly, and they had all the Looney Tune characters on board, and at the end of that cruise, we played Win a Cruise Bingo, and I won a cruise. I was 8, so my mom had to claim it. I couldn't claim it, but yeah. No, it became, my mom loved it because, she was bringing me and my brother on board. She loved that there were kids programs so that we could go have fun and she could go do her thing. And, it became kind of a great way to for us to travel as a family. And then I just never stopped. We did a couple on Premiere, and then we did some Princess, some Carnival, some Celebrity, Royal Caribbean. We did kind of all the typical, more family ones that you'd find in my younger years.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I got out of college and wanted to travel a bit, I looked up, which cruise lines are good to work for, which ones treat their crew well, and sent my applications out. And the rest, as they say, is history.
Now, if I recall in interviewing you for The Joy of Cruising again, your academic background was not directly relevant to cruising. Talk about your motivation for going to school and then kind of, not quite, don't take this literally, but kind of tossing school aside and going to the ocean. What encouraged you to do that?
So my original career goal was to design cruise ships. I went on ships, and when I was really getting into cruising, as a youth and teenager, was right when the Grand Princess came out, and then she was the biggest ship in the world, and then the Voyager class came out, and the Queen Mary too, and it was a big, that time period in the kind of the early 2000s was really big for cruise ship design and what was happening and the changes that were being made, and just moving the bar forward from like the ocean liner to the modern cruise ship that we see now. And I thought it was fascinating. I thought it was the coolest thing in the world. And then when I went looking at colleges, I realized that to be a cruise ship designer, I was going to have to live fairly far away from home. That career wasn't really an option in Vermont or in the Northeast. And so I thought, okay, well, maybe I can take that passion that I had for designing ships and I can turn that into designing buildings. And so that's what directed me towards getting a degree in architectural engineering. So the cruise ships actually kind of guided what I ended up going to school for to begin with. But then when I first got out of college, I was like, I don't think I want to settle down for, a 9-to-5 job right now with only a couple of weeks of vacation. There's a big world I want to go explore. And so I looked up jobs that I would be qualified for on board. My degree did not directly correlate to anything on board, but I had spent quite a few summers as a camp counselor. And so that gave me the background to be able to work in the youth program on board. So then that ended up being my shoe-in to working on the ship. And so then I worked on board I started as a youth staff, and then I was the supervisor for a while. And through a series of life events, decided that I should go have a land life. So my cruise ship career actually kind of has different segments to it. So right after college, I went and I worked on board, and then I felt like I needed to spend some time at home. That while you get time at home when you're working on the ship, you get those months that you get for vacation, but there were a lot of things that were happening throughout the year that I felt I needed to be around for. And so then I worked in my field. I worked for a mechanical designer, or a consulting engineering firm as a mechanical designer. And then I worked for a residential construction company. I did all that for a few years. And
Now, Iris, let me back you up. So you started with the youth activities work,
yes.
on ship, and then you went back into private industry.
Yes. Yeah. So I started. So right after college, I spent 2.5 years on board, and then so my grandpa was sick, and I didn't want to be away from home while my grandpa was sick. So
Okay.
so I was like, okay, I guess it's time for me to look into what I went to school for. And then I did that for a few years. During that time, my grandpa passed away, but I'm very grateful that I was able to be home to be around during that time. yeah, so then I thought, okay, I'm going to go back. I emailed my supervisor in the corporate office. I said, hey, I think I'm going to be done with my job on land. I don't know what's next for me. I'm really just looking for maybe, I don't know, a month to 2 month contract just while I figure out what my next move is. Um, Ended up being where I met my husband. And then that changed the trajectory of absolutely everything in my life. So,
And then you decided, I think I want to be out at sea a little longer than 2 months.
yeah, so I can't say what would have happened if I hadn't met Stuart, but I met him, and then our next contract was able to be lined up together. And after that, it was like, okay, he's my guy, he's my forever. So I guess we're gonna shift our life plans a little bit and stay at sea for a bit longer.
So talk about the creation of Life of Iris.
So this actually happened. So I came back to work on board. I worked as the supervisor for the kids program, and then I was the trainer for the kids program for a couple years. And then we were having a hard time getting our contracts lined up, and I decided to take a break from working and sail with my husband. And so this is actually when, we kind of got introduced to each other, was after I'd created Life of Iris, but while I was sailing as spouse on board. And so I was sailing as spouse on board with my husband. So my husband's an engineer on board, and within his role, he can bring a +1 of sorts, significant other. So so I was able to sail with him, and we were about to head out on the 2020 Grand World Voyage, and I wasn't working on board for that cruise. And so I thought to myself, I'd like to chronicle this. I'd like to document it somehow. It's an interesting life that we're living. And, even if no one read it, even if it was just for me to keep kind of a journal of sorts of where we went, or maybe my family would read it, I thought it could be something interesting to start. And so I started writing and looked up, how to put a blog together and the website part of it, and decided to start that in, just before the World Cruise in 2020.
So before we talk about the World Cruise, and you've kind of done a little bit of this, but give us an overview of what it's like being a spouse on board.
So
not necessarily on the World Cruise,
right, just
in general.
Yeah. So spouse on board is a policy that's available, at least with our cruise line, for pretty much any officer that's guaranteed their own cabin. So if you're guaranteed to have a single, an officer style cabin, then you'd be eligible for this kind of situation. So actually the role that I most recently did on board, I would also have had this privilege if he wanted to sail with me. But he never thought that sounded like too much fun. My cabin, my cabin isn't as big as his. So being spouse on board, you kind of live this in between life. You're not a crew member and you're not a passenger. You live in crew areas. You can go to crew areas. You also can go to passenger areas. You can go to the shows. You can, just be in all the passenger areas. You don't wear a uniform. You don't wear a name tag. And so you kind of exist in this little in-between world between the crew life and the passenger life. And you get to sail. Sometimes that is sailing around the world. Sometimes that is doing the same itinerary in Alaska 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 times in a row. It just depends on where your partner is assigned and what ship they're on. And you stay in their cabin, and it's, it can be, my mother always said only boring people get bored. I've had people that have said, oh, you're doing the same itinerary as spouse on board over and over again. You must get so bored, but you I don't know. I knew that when I went to sail, like for instance, doing an Alaskan itinerary over and over again, that, I wasn't going to be working. There's only, you can, when you're doing a repeating itinerary, for the most part, the cruise line kind of sets things. So you set, which show happens on which day, and the schedule for the music and the food schedule, and all of it is kind of, this is what it is for the week. And then, you'll take feedback. So everyone keep writing in your comment cards. So you'll take feedback and you'll adjust a little bit, but kind of keep the same structure throughout the season. So when you're doing that as a passenger over and over again, or as a spouse on board, which kind of ends up being in the passenger realm because you're not spending 10 hours a day working, people just figured I would get bored, but you plan for it. You bring books and knitting, and you do writing, and you go on every excursion that you possibly can and just soak up the beauty of the place that you're in. So, it's a lovely life. It can be, because you're kind of existing between two worlds. I think it probably could be a little bit lonely if you didn't know people ahead of time, if you weren't building those friendships and relationships. I was lucky. I only sailed as spouse on board on a ship that I had already worked on. And so I kind of had built-in friendships. Like I had friends that I'd had for years and years that then I was seeing. And so they'd be like, hey, I've got some free time. Let's go ashore together. Or let's go have dinner and whatnot. So I think there's potential. It could be kind of lonely depending on your personality and where you are. But for me, it was always a very positive experience.
For spouses on board who, unlike you, were not also employees of the cruise line, do they have access to like the crew bar and the crew facilities?
After COVID, it was very restricted. Now it is much more open. If I was to go sail as spouse on board with my husband now, I would expect to have access to the crew bar. When I had sailed with him prior to COVID, I was able to go to the crew bar and participate in crew events.
Some listeners may be wondering why would I ask about the crew bar and the crew areas? And I interviewed previously. I interviewed a longtime crew member, and he had lots of stories about the crew bar. But the most compelling, if you will, is the cheap drinks at the crew bar.
Drinks, yeah. In my company, you kind of end up on the same privileges that your spouse has, and so I'd be able to get them at the crew rate out and about on the ship. So I'm not.
Oh, okay.
I'm not going to disclose exactly what that rate is, but it's
sure.
It's not a full price situation.
Okay. Well, that's a nice a nice extra benefit actually.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, the crew bar is where life happens for crew members, basically. So and I'm saying that, and I have a feeling that people are probably picturing these big parties that happen. And, there is the party aspect of it. But there's also, meeting with some friends to play a round of cards, or, you set up the TV and you play Mario Kart or something. Like it's not, there's different sides to how the crew bar life is, but it's, it is where I met my husband. So there's that.
What? Well, you beat me to it because I quoted you on that in the book. So I was going to say someone I know met their husband in a crew bar, but you just stole the words from me.
Is where all good romances start. Actually,
and I said in the book something, I can't remember exactly what I said, but that sounds romantic.
Yeah. No, I say that kind of jokingly, and I mean, there's definitely kind of a perception of cruise ship life, and especially for those that are kind of in their 20s of cruise ship life.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
There's a perception that it's a lot of hookup culture kind of deal. But I have a lot of friends that have met their spouses or their life partners working on ships. Like there is a lot of us out there actually that have met their forever person and that are married with kids and, have this whole life because they happen to be assigned to the same ship as the person that they ended up falling in love with. So
You accompanied your husband as a spouse on board on the Grand World Voyage. In the intro, I alluded to the fact that not one, but two global crises touch you directly. And the first was on the Grand World Voyage. So take us through that voyage.
So for anyone that hasn't done a grand voyage or a really long cruise, I'm just going to give a quick explanation. So Grand World Voyage, so that's going to be a cruise that most of the time will go all the way around the world. It depends on which cruise line you're with. But these cruises tend to have passengers that have done them year after year after year. And so getting on the 2020 World Cruise, I'd been on the 2019, and in the summer of 2019 is when I got married. And so when I got on board, I actually had to carry my laptop around because so many passengers wanted to see wedding pictures. They're like, everyone was so excited. Yeah, they was like, oh my gosh, Iris, you're back. Let me see the wedding pictures. They were so excited. Plus one of the, a crew member that was on the 2020 World Cruise was one of my bridesmaids. There was another woman that was sailing as spouse on board as well, who was a bridesmaid. So like the ship kind of knew, like the passengers knew our relationship, and they saw us go from engaged to married, and they wanted to see the pictures and they wanted to be part of it. So the people that sail on these cruises, a lot of times they'll do it every single year. And so they know each other, they know the crew. It's all kind of a bit like a family. And
I was going to say, it sounds like an extended family.
Yeah. And you're going around the world. So you get to see, I don't know how to describe it other than to say the world. You're going to, I joined just after Antarctica on that particular voyage, but the ship had just been to Antarctica. I joined in Chile, and then we went to Easter Island. We were over in French Polynesia.
So let me back you up. So the Grand World Voyage.
So it started in Fort Lauderdale, and then it made its way down the eastern coast of South America.
Okay.
And went to Antarctica. And then just after Antarctica, so about a month into the voyage, is when my husband's contract was scheduled to start.
Okay.
And so I joined in, I want to say it was Santiago, Chile.
Okay.
That year, I think. But it was in Chile. And so that's also where my husband joined. So with spouse on board, you can only be on board at the same time as when your spouse is.
Sure.
For the most part, on those long cruises, if you're in a passenger-facing role, they want you to be on for the duration, so from the start to the finish. But because my husband is more of a behind-the-scenes role as an engineer, they'll have his role changing out, throughout the cruise. And so we joined in Chile, and then went, we went across the Pacific to Easter Island, South Pacific, French Polynesia, New Zealand. And then we got to Australia. We had a few lovely days in Australia. And then that's when the pandemic drastically affected everything.
You might have said this, but refresh my memory. What was the timing of this?
So this would be mid-March in 2020.
Okay.
So I think we were in Sydney maybe on March 6th and 7th, if I'm remembering correctly.
Okay.
And the World Cruise started at the beginning of January. So the cruise was about 2 months in. I'd been on for about 5 weeks.
Okay.
When everything started changing. And I mean, we'd heard, there was another ship that wasn't being allowed to dock, but that was north of us up in Asia, and we had heard about different travel restrictions, but everything, the first couple of days we were in Australia, everything was totally normal. Like, I was hopping on a ferry to go to Bondi Beach, and just everything was normal. Like,
Living your life.
yeah, we were just I mean, it was as if nothing was different at all. And then within a few days of that, so we left Sydney, then Tom Hanks got COVID and he was in Australia. I remember that. Sorry, I know that's such a random aside, but then everyone's like, oh, this is in Australia. This is a thing.
Oh, so
And
I remember when Tom Hanks got COVID, but I didn't realize he was in Australia.
yeah, and we were in Australia at the same time. And so then I don't know. It's just one of those things that you're like, oh, okay, because no one knew how big of a situation this was going to be. At that point, it was kind of just isolated spots around the world. And because the whole shutdown happened, like, it was fast when it happened. And so, we had a couple more ports in Australia. Then we started hearing, okay, the cruise is going to keep going. We were going somewhere in Africa. That was getting canceled. We were going to add a couple days in India. Like, there were some changes that were happening, but at that point, it seemed like everything was still going to continue. It was just going to get shifted as various countries were starting to close and whatnot. And then we went to Cairns, Australia, because I went on a tour to go snorkeling on the Great Barrier Reef, and that was a disaster. It was raining horribly. One of the engines on the tour boat broke, and when we finally got back to the ship from that tour was when it was like, okay, everyone is disembarking it was 5 or 6 days from then in Perth. So we were heading to Fremantle, and we were told, okay, nope, it's done. Everyone's got to go home. Cruise guests expect that they're going to be going home from Fort Lauderdale. Some of them purposely choose these grand world voyages, or these grand voyages, so that they don't have to fly, so that they can drive to Florida, or they don't like to fly, they won't fly, they have health reasons that they don't fly. And so then it became a week-long scramble as to how everyone was going to get home. There was a lot of different rumors going on of whether or not certain airlines were going to be flying, which countries were going to be closed. Then you just kept hearing stories of other ships where the country closed and the country closed. We heard a rumor right before we got to
Wow.
Fremantle that Australia was going to be closed to cruise ships, and we're like, but that's where we're going to disembark everybody. There were so many different rumors that were flying around and existing at that point that, I mean, it was stressful, but it was part of the stress was just not having any idea. Like, you didn't know if one country was going to close. I didn't know when I was going to leave the ship, because I was on a spouse on board. So it's like, am I going to also be leaving in Fremantle? Am I going to get to stay on board once I leave? My husband is from a different country than me. When am I going to get to see him again if I do have to leave? And so there was just a lot of uncertainty that existed in that time.
Wow. There was a lot of uncertainty and I'm sure stress among the crew and people like yourself, spouse on board. What was it like, to the best that you could tell? What was it like for the passengers?
For some of them that had been following the news, they could see that the rest of the world was shutting down, and okay, this is what's happening, and kind of wanting to get home. They were in the category of like, if this is what's happening for the rest of the world, we'd rather get home. There was also a chunk of passengers that were like, the ship feels pretty safe. Maybe can we just stay? Can we stay? Why can't we just stay here? And they really struggled to understand why they couldn't stay on board. After we disembark everyone, like, why they, like, with no itinerary, nothing, just like, why can't we just stay on the ship? It feels safe here. So they had a lot of different emotions that were going on. Everyone was kind of scrambling to figure out the best way to do everything. And Yeah, there was one day. There's these two passengers that I've known for years now, like literally probably, I don't know, almost 10 years at this point. And they're the nicest people. And they had a moment where I could see the stress. Like they never, I don't know, the only way I could say is that they never treated me like a crew member. They never complained. They never made me feel like, oh, you need to go do your job now. They always, it was, kind of like an aunt and uncle that were visiting. And I saw them one day and they were mad at me on behalf of like their flights. And I was like, but they're lovely people. I'm not holding it against them, but like I could tell the stress that was happening for them. I mean, everyone, nobody knew what was going on, and we're on the other side of the world. They don't know how they're going to get home. They're leaving their luggage on the ship in most cases. Most of them, left their luggage on board because they weren't able to bring that many suitcases home. Most people that do the world cruise bring 6 or 7 suitcases with them. So, yeah, and so it was a lot of questions, and nobody knew what was going on. So um, just a lot of uncertainty. There were some people that were genuinely terrified to fly, whether it be for health reasons or just a fear of flying. So that was interesting to be around how that ended up playing out. I mean, they ended up having to fly home because that was the only option that existed. But
So you get to Fremantle. The last several days, the crew has been working hard to get everyone to flights and all of that. I suspect your role was transitioning a little bit from spouse on board to helping the crew take care of the passengers getting off the ship, right?
yeah, so I mean, none of it was expected of me, but I mean, you're in a situation that's so beyond anything that someone could expect. So for that last week on board, I was volunteering. I mean, none of it was official work by any means, but
When did it become clear to you that you weren't getting off at Fremantle?
maybe it was only like a day or two before we got there that I actually had a final answer on that. And it actually was because the captain's wife was on board and she had found out that she wasn't going home. And I said, okay, that means I'm not going home either. And someone was like, well, how does that mean that? And I'm like, she's on board on the same policy that I'm on board as. Like, for intents and purposes, we're equal. Like, her spouse might be the captain, but that doesn't change the policy that we're here as. So if she gets to stay, that means I get to stay.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah. So that's when I kind of found out, and then it wasn't that bad. Yes, we had to figure out how to get everyone home from the cruise when we were in Australia, but we didn't have COVID on board. I got to stay on board with my husband. Like, I don't want to downplay the stress of the situation that we were in, but there were other people. I have friends that were on ships that had COVID on board and were navigating through that. And I have friends that were on ships that when they were allowed to get off the ship, their country was closed. So like, even though cruising stopped that year in March, I have friends that didn't get to go home until September or later, just because of additional situations that they were dealing with.
Wow.
Whether it be that their country was closed or that the country that their spouse was from was closed and they weren't allowed to go to the same place or whatever. There was a lot of situations that were happening. And, there were ships that had COVID on board and the struggles that they went through. So, while we had our own journey and uncertainties and all of that, our ship never had COVID on board. Like we disembarked everyone, and then we had
Hmm.
months of kind of floating around, not quite sure what was going on. But we didn't have COVID on board, and I was there with my husband.
Say a little bit about how your role evolved
So,
after
I mean,
Fremantle.
everyone's role shifted and changed as we kind of got closer to figuring out when people were going to be able to disembark, and everyone needs to wear masks going home. I actually had a sewing machine on board. I quite enjoy sewing and doing crafts and things. And so then I started, at one point we ended up disembarked, the tailors on board got disembarked, and then we were somewhere hot and someone goes, "Hey, Iris, I don't have any shorts on board. Could you turn this pair of pants into a pair of shorts?" And so then, okay, sure. So I turned that into a pair of shorts. And then someone goes, "Hey, I've only got one pair of jeans on the ship. We can't get any more. We can't get anything on board. I've got a hole in them. Could you patch my jeans for me?" So then I packed a pair of jeans. Actually, even before the passengers left, they knew that I had a little sewing machine on board. And so they'd be like, "Oh, I've got a tear in my shirt. Could you fix my seam for me?" And so, the passengers that I'd known for years, they'd ask me like, "Oh, can you fix a seam?" And then they'd buy me a bottle of wine. And it was kind of cute. But yeah.
The crew knew because you had worked with many of them, and the passengers knew because you said many of them came back, on a repetitive basis. They kind of knew that you were Iris, the sewing machine lady.
So then it was, "Oh, I've got a hole in my clothes. Can you fix it for me?" And, "I need this. Can you have my pants? Can you do this and this and this?" And then I also had quite a bit of extra fabric on board. And so then I started making face masks for people for when they were flying home. So I probably made maybe 30 face masks for different people when they were heading home in fabrics that I'd gotten, around the world that I just thought were pretty or whatnot. So yeah,
Hmm.
it ended up being a little, it wasn't a job. I didn't get paid for it or anything. It's just a little way that I could help while I was on board.
So eventually, the Grand World Cruise, the aborted Grand World Cruise, came to an end. When did you finally get home?
I flew home at the end of June. So the cruise ended in the middle of March. And I was on for another, would that be 3 months past then?
Wow.
Yeah, which was, it was partially, a lot of it was because countries were closed. They didn't want people. They didn't want people from cruise ships, because cruise ships at that point had gotten this terrible bad rap in the news and the media, and it was that we were spreading COVID around the world and everything. And we're all just sitting there and we're like, "We don't have COVID on board. Like, we're totally safe. Like, we're probably more safe than everybody else." And so it was finding a country that would allow crew to leave the ship. And so I ended up flying home from Manila in the Philippines. There were probably 25 ships or so that were sitting in the bay in Manila. We called it the Manila Flotilla. And yeah, to disembark crew. And so the day that I left, so you disembark by a tender, and then so we would actually stop, because they charged a certain amount for the tender to actually go get docked ashore to then get us to the bus to then get to the airport and all that. And so there'd be maybe one or two crew members from, a handful of the different ships that were there that were leaving. And so when I left, we stopped at a princess ship. We stopped at a Cunard ship. I think we stopped at two princess ships actually to pick people up. And so, yeah, then made my way home from Manila to Vermont. So I disembarked. My husband didn't. My husband stayed on
Hmm.
board because for him to leave the ship, he needed his replacement to be able to come on board. And the Philippines, the visa office had closed, I think is what happened, is the visa office was closed because of COVID. And so crew members weren't able to get the correct visa to fly into the Philippines to then be able to join the ship. So my husband didn't leave the ship then. He was on board for another month after that until his replacement could get on board.
So when you finally got home, we were well into the cruising lockdown. So we're not going to talk about that because that's depressing enough.
Although, Well, I do. So the cruising lockdown happened, but cruising was still affecting my life because, like, so my husband got off the ship, and then he had a vacation, and then his function still existed during lockdown. Like, there were still crew members that had to go to the ship during the lockdown, and my husband would still go out for like, a 3-month contract that, with a 2-week quarantine. And so different jobs on board, there were still crew members that were going to sea during that entire lockdown period, and they would just sit on board and go ashore, but they still had the ship's function.
Okay. So for you, the lockdown directly impacted you in that it resulted in your husband being away.
Yeah. I mean, it affected, I wasn't, at that point, I wasn't working on board, so it didn't affect me in that way. It affected, many, probably hundreds of thousands of people from the cruise industry in that way. But for me, it was, it was a lot of extra time apart from my husband because I wasn't allowed to go on board and he still had to go to work.
So talk about getting back on the ocean after the restart.
So after the restart, so things started back up. Cruise lines would start a few ships at a time. And I actually, after the restart, when I first went back to sea, was as a crew member again. So I had applied. I'd been in contact with one of the supervisors or the hiring managers for one of the roles on board, and was like, as things restart, I'm interested. I'm game. Let me know what becomes available. And then anyways, he ended up contacting me. I went through the hiring process. This was for a new role on board, and got the job. Went out to sea, went for a few weeks in training. And then, so my few weeks of training was on a different ship than my husband. And then I was getting transferred to the same ship that he was on. And that ship we were going to be restarting. We were going to be bringing that ship back into service. And then a couple days before I was transferring ships, we found out that ship was, instead of going back into regular service at that point, it was going to be used to house Ukrainian refugees for the summer. And so, so then.
So the world changed the second time.
World changed number 2. So then last summer, the ship that I was on was used. It was used as housing for Ukrainian refugees. So basically, we were kind of like the first stop, and all the efforts that were happening on board were very organized by the Dutch Salvation Army. I can't give them enough credit for everything that they did for these people during that time. But yeah, they would come on board, and the Salvation Army would work to find them housing, work to get them set up with jobs, help them just integrate into Dutch society with bank accounts, how to get health, and how to go to a doctor's appointment with Dutch lessons, English lessons. We primarily had families that were children, and so organizing this for them, arts and crafts classes, different events in the city. And so we were kind of the base for things to get kind of organized until they could get housing elsewhere, because we were only a temporary situation. It wasn't going to be that anyone was going to be living on board for a year. The ship ended up being there for about 6 months, and we on average had about 1,500 people on board, 1,500 family members, and of those, about 500 were children, which was a very different experience having that many kids on board. It was, a lot of times, because I a lot of times would sail long voyages and there'd only be a couple kids on board, and instead we have 500. Yeah, so it was totally different than what my job on board normally would be, but an incredible and, heartbreaking, but also uplifting experience, if that makes sense. Like, just devastating for the situation that they're going through, but then it showed you a lot of the resilience of the human spirit and also the kindness of people in the world that exist too. So you're seeing the awful and the kindness at the same time in it. So
Just for a little more perspective, I say the world changed, at least a part of the world. As you know, Russia invaded Ukraine with a blistering attack that led to the greatest refugee exodus since World War II. I lost contact with Iris for several weeks. I know that she was off. The last I had spoken to her, she was off for training for her new role. And by the way, that new role was a media manager, right?
yes, yeah.
And so I was a little concerned because I couldn't contact Iris. I was in the midst of writing her feature, and then I heard from her, and yes, just as she had told me several weeks prior, she did join Stuart on her new ship home, and she was working as the ship's media manager. But as Iris has told us, the ship wasn't sailing. So what did a media manager do with 1,500 guests who were not conventional cruise passengers?
So my role was basically entirely different. I worked very closely with the Salvation Army to organize the different events that were happening on board, because they were using our onboard spaces like the meeting rooms, the various lounges, the theater. They were using all of these venues, but they're not necessarily familiar with the venues. And so I was helping them coordinate it turned into a lot of event management. So part of it was the event management side, just helping them organize the events on board, and making sure they had what they needed to run those events successfully, and then coordinate between our onboard departments and then the Salvation Army. But then the other part was they had a lot of messaging that they needed to get out to these families that were on board, whether that be letting them know when different events were happening, or just all the different things that were happening. And so on the ships, we have digital screens scattered throughout the ship. And then we also have the stateroom TVs. And so I would work with them to get messaging out when they wanted to the families that were on board, whether that be through the stateroom TV system, through the digital screens, or through announcements. So we would do announcements every day in both English and Ukrainian. And so I would work with the translators that we had on board to make sure that we were getting all the announcements out there for the families on board.
So this non-sailing ship served essentially as a hotel.
It was essentially, as a hotel that had meeting rooms and venues and food. So we had food. The kids would go get their school lunches in the morning. And
were they able to have the full run of the ship? I mean, they had the 3 meals a day. There was no entertainment, no pools or anything, right?
So the pools weren't open. So the ship was literally docked for the whole time, and trying to do the pools with 500 kids on board, and also being able to offload that water and then unload new water wasn't really feasible. So the pools were closed. There wasn't any entertainment by the cruise line, but like they would, that we would work to organize with them a talent show. And so they would use our theater for them to have a talent show for the kids. And there'd be sometimes there'd be volunteer groups that would come on, that would bring a musical group. There'd be a band that would come on board. And so it wasn't any entertainment that was from us, but there were volunteer groups in the area that would come offer. Sometimes there'd be entertainment on board. A lot of times they'd coordinate buses for people to go ashore. They had access to go ashore, but they'd coordinate buses for concerts that were happening ashore. For food, they ate in the buffet area, and then there was no like sit down restaurant service. There wasn't, the specialty restaurants. The bars weren't open. It was nothing in that category of things. But for them, they had the run of most of the ship. the basketball courts were open. They could use that if they wanted to. They could, yeah, they were able to be out and about around the ship. It was certainly, they treated it like it was their home pretty much, because it was for a while there. But it was not operated in a normal cruise ship fashion.
So when your stint ended on that ship, were there still guests, refugees on there, or how did that come to an end for you?
So when I left, there were still these families on board. They were there. I left the end of July, and the last families left the ship at the beginning of October, and then, or sorry, not the beginning of October, beginning of September, and then when I came back to the ship, I came back to that same ship towards the end of September, and then we resumed passenger sailing.
We're talking about 22, right?
2022, yeah. So the last families left the very beginning of September, and then it was just 2 weeks, pretty much 2 weeks later, is when we welcomed our first traditional guests back on board.
You're obviously not on that ship anymore, based on the background that I see. So what are you doing now?
So let's see. So I had a couple more contracts on that ship since 2022. So I was lucky enough, I was able to go back to that same ship a few times and travel the world a bit more. And now life is all different. So during my last contract on board, I found out I was pregnant.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Yes, and everything is going good so far. So far, baby's healthy, I'm healthy, everything's good. But there's all sorts of rules that exist about basically being pregnant on a cruise ship. So I found out I was pregnant. I went and told the medical staff. Yeah, and as long as things are healthy and well and good, and you're not considered high-risk pregnancy, then for the most part, and I'm putting lots of asterisks with this because it really depends on your health situation, as well as the baby's health and the cruise line that you're working on and the region of the world you're in. So this is not carry-all for every single person, but in my situation, I was able to stay on board for the rest of my contract. But at this point, I am actually too pregnant to sail. It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm done with ships forever, but this is this is where life is at right now. I can't be on board. I literally can't be on board because of the pregnancy, and so we're adjusting. This is part of having a career and a life at sea and being a woman. To be honest, is if you want to have a family, there's going to be points where you literally can't be on board if you're having, your own biological child, if you're able to and or want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
It's just becomes not an option for medical reasons.
If I may ask, when are you due?
I'm due the middle of December 21st.
Okay. Because I was going to say your episode will air in November, and I would kind of jump in and give an update of the baby's name and gender and all that stuff, but it will not. We hope that it will not have happened. It will not have happened by then. Okay. Well, we're going to have you back on anyway, so we'll get a chance. And by the time we have you back on, maybe when I interview you, you can hold the baby up to the screen. So, well, Iris, you have had, as I said in the introduction, I mean, there's very few people in the world who can say their cruising life brought them directly in contact with the two major global crises of the 21st century. And I know that sounds like hyperbole, but think about it. It is. You did yeoman's work on the world cruise, but the work you did with the guests somehow I hate calling them refugees on that ship, is that's something you will hold on to for the rest of your life.
Yeah, it was, yeah, it probably will end up, when I look back on my life, being one of the most impactful experiences that I ever had. So,
Yeah, yeah.
and we would, mostly we referred to our guests on board during that time either as families or residents. So
Okay, good.
because you could see the experience. I mean, you'd walk around the ship and you'd see someone on a video chat and they'd be crying hysterically, and you would have heard on the news something horrible that just happened, and that person might be having the worst day in their life, but they have a little that
Yeah.
they're going to have to help through it. So yeah, no, it was definitely one of the most impactful experiences I've ever had.
Iris, before we let you go, we're going to shift from kind of a somber subject to a light subject or even fun subject. So I just want to ask you a couple of fun cruise questions that I ask all of my guests. The first is really just so I can, get some ideas. What's your favorite cruise drink and cruise food?
Okay, so I'm going to tell you about a secret drink that's not typically on a menu. And
Let me ask you this. By any chance, is it called a wang wang?
it is. Oh, you know about the wang wang.
Well, I'm cheating because I did have actually on your line. No wonder he knew. Well, no wonder because I had a former cruise director.
Yep.
He's no longer a cruise director, but he's still in cruising. He's a sort of a host at Theme Cruises, but he was the top cruise director when he was there. Do you know Jason Venner?
Oh my God, you had Jason Venner on? I
Yes.
worked with Venner. Oh my God.
Oh, I wish I had known that when I interviewed him. Yeah, go back and
Oh
I'll
my God.
send you the link. But yeah,
I'll message
yeah,
him. Yeah, no, I think
yeah.
him and I had wing wings together. Yeah. Yeah, so a wang wing is kind of notorious. It's kind of like a Long Island in terms of it just has a lot of different alcohols in it, with fruit juice, and yeah, no, it's when I was younger, um, the way I'd have them more regularly. Now, if I have them, it's like one, and it's not a great situation. I can more, but
Well, your line is on my bucket list. It's one of the few major lines I have not done, but I can't wait to when I get on and I go to the bar and I say, "Can you make a wang wang?" And the bartender's going to look at me like, "This guy has inside information."
how did you know that?
So, what
I
about
guess
food?
they're gonna make it extra strong for you too. I guarantee it. Um, for food, it really depends on where in the world we're sailing. This summer there was crab carbonara because we were up in Alaska, and so it had fresh crab on it, and that was just fabulous.
Wow.
Um, yeah, it was every catch a can night. It was once a week, and I always made a point to get it. I don't know. It really depends on where we are. I mean, I have my favorites at all of the specialty restaurants that we usually have. Yeah, it really depends on the region. Like if we're over in Asia, then I'll really get into the stir fry side of things. I love all the seafood that we get on board, though.
What's your most memorable, happiest, funniest, or even most embarrassing cruise or port experience?
Okay, so probably I'm going to say the most memorable. I mean, there's a lot of memories around the world, but I got engaged in Bora Bora. So my husband and I were both working on board, and we managed to get most of the day off. And so we went ashore in Bora Bora, and we had lunch at this lovely restaurant, and then we were going swimming on the beach, and that's when he asked me to marry him. And then so Bora Bora, I don't know, it's obviously memorable just because it's where one of the biggest things in my life happened. So
Speaking of that, going to all of those places in the world, some very exotic. I mean, Bora Bora. I ask everyone what's on their bucket list, and Bora Bora is near the top of everyone's bucket list. So with all of those, exotic places you go to, do you have a bucket list?
So I've been very lucky. I've checked a lot of things that would be on people's bucket list off. Like, I've climbed the Great Wall of China. We went to Petra. We rode camels in Petra as we pretended we were Indiana Jones and we're searching for the Holy Grail. I've swam on the Great Barrier Reef. I've definitely been able to do a lot of bucket list kind of things. I still haven't been to Antarctica. So Antarctica is definitely on my list. I would say Antarctica is probably the current top of my list. And then a shorter journey, an adventure would be, I've always wanted to do a transatlantic crossing on the Queen Mary 2, just for the literal, just as classic as cruising can be. So I think that would be an interesting voyage. So, but
Antarctica is definitely on my bucket list, and a transatlantic crossing. Now I'm booked for a transatlantic crossing, but it's not on the Queen Mary.
Yeah.
It's on Virgin Voyages, but I do have it on my bucket list to do a Cunard cruise one of these days.
I'm not sure what my most embarrassing would be. Yeah, I've had lots of great experiences ashore, and just the whole cruising thing. But it's so hard because, I couldn't even quantify how much time I've spent on a ship if I tried to.
Yeah.
It's past hundreds of days. It's literal years and years and years at this point. So,
you've got unmatched memories, or just from talking to you, between the Grand World Voyage and all that happened with that, and then between the work you did as a result of the Ukraine crisis, and then getting engaged at Bora Bora. You've got some unbelievable memories.
Well, those are kind of big moments, but then I spent seasons sailing in the Mediterranean and having overnights in Venice and Istanbul. And I got to go to Israel last year. I sailed on the Amazon River for a few weeks last year. And I've been to Asia. I've had a tea ceremony in Japan.
Oh, wow.
I've been able to explore so much of the world. Literally just so much of it's kind of, so there was someone that was talking about Tahiti the other day, and I was like, oh, I can tell you where my favorite restaurant is right in Papiete. Or there, and just, in Puerto Rico, I could tell you where my favorite restaurant is there. It's just around the world. I kind of have this, because some places I've just, gone back to over and over. And it's I have my, the things that I like to do when I'm in Sydney. And, why would a farm girl from Vermont have a list of things that she likes to do when she's in Sydney, Australia? And how would she have been there enough to have that list? It's, cruising has exposed me to so much of the world. And, I'm grateful for that from the bucket list. I want to see the architecture and all the land and the beauty that's there. But then it also, the wildfires that just happened in Maui, in Lahaina. I spent an entire season sailing back and forth to Hawaii, and have spent so much time in Lahaina. And it takes something that you might see just, on your TV screen, and it makes it real. It gives you a lot more of a perspective as to, this is a place that's beautiful and wonderful, and there's good people there, and there's nice people there. And so it's just, I've been to probably 70 something countries, and cruising has exposed me to so much, and I'm very grateful for it. And I'm not done yet. I'm still gonna, lots of the world left to see.
You can write a memoir.
I can write a memoir.
By the
So,
speaking of writing, what about Life of Iris? Are you going to continue that?
yes, so I am going to continue it. I have a few posts in the works. This summer, I actually, for vacation, went on a 2-week seaborne cruise to Norway with my mom. And
Oh, Seaboard.
yeah, seaborne. Oh,
Us ultra
yeah, it
luxury.
is not a bad way to live. So I've got a post that I'm working on for that. I also went on a vacation with my husband on a cruise to Alaska, ironically, but we'd never gone on vacation there together. Yeah, I've got some posts that I'm working on. I must admit, being pregnant is a very different experience it's so much more exhausting than I ever thought it could be. And so, so my last contract on board, I didn't really do much writing because I had horrible morning sickness, and then I was still working cruise ship hours. So I'm getting back into the swing of it. Life of Iris will keep going. I've got a lot more blogs to do, and so it'll keep going. I have still been posting a bit on social media, so if you follow me there, that's probably the best spot to keep up with what's going on Instagram and Twitter.
Yeah. Tell the listeners, how can they access Life of Iris and follow you in general on social media and the internet?
Yeah, so my blog is lifeofiris.com. Just spell it out just like that. There's quite a few posts on cruising, crew life. There is a section about 2020 and 2021. So just about life and travel during the pandemic times. And then I'm on social media, Life of Iris blog on Instagram and Twitter. And then I also have a Facebook page. So if you'd like to follow me on any of that, that would be wonderful. I'm also happy to answer questions. I do on my blog dive a lot into different aspects of crew life and how crew life works. I have found that for a lot of crew members, when they first got on board, they didn't really know what to expect. They didn't know what the process was going to look like. And so I ended up writing quite a bit about that. I do also have a small YouTube channel. I am planning on creating more content for that. That tends to focus on grand voyages because I think they're an incredible way to see the world. So I have some videos about different world cruises, and I've got some content coming up in regards to different world voyages, different ways, or not world, different grand voyages, or different ways to see the world, a big swath of the world on these longer, more immersive cruises.
So the last light or fun question, I call this an oddball question, only because it doesn't necessarily have to do with cruising at all. I know you have a lot of fans and followers, both between Life of Iris and then all of your cruise line colleagues and friends, and I'm sure you have loads of friends in Vermont. So welcome to the Life of Iris fans and friends and family of Iris who are joining us today. Share one thing that my listeners and your fans don't know about Iris.
Something they don't know about me. Well, unless you're in my inner circle, you might not have known that I was pregnant until you listened to this. Because I haven't put that on anywhere, and that hasn't been online at all anywhere.
There you go. Well, now it is news to the world.
News to the world.
I wish that I had the kind of reach that I could really say this is news to the world. Although I am on a streaming platform in Africa.
Oh.
And it's the biggest streaming platform in Africa. So yeah, it's truly getting worldwide exposure.
Yeah. So the people that I worked with on my last contract, quite a few of them knew, just because sometimes I'd have to leave a meeting because I had morning sickness and things like that.
Sick all the time. Yeah.
But yeah, no, because in this life that I'm leading, being pregnant has such an impact on the career aspect of it. I just I haven't wanted to answer the question over and over again about like everything that's going to change in our life. It obviously is a big change for anyone when they have a child, but it's an extensive amount of changes in my life for it. So yeah, so this is everybody, baby is on the way.
Well, thank you. I am honored that you chose to break that news on the Joy of Cruising podcast. I feel special. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Iris, thank you for coming on the Joy of Cruising podcast, and all the best to you and Stuart and the baby.
Thank you.
I look forward to getting back on the ocean for work or pleasure. And we would love to have you back on. I know we will have you back on the show. So I assuming you're willing, you can pencil that in for early 24.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for having me. It has been a pleasure. I always love talking cruising. So, and I look forward to hearing how your transatlantic goes.
Yeah. And by the way, thank you for being in the book as well.
Oh yeah, thank you for having me in the book. It's a great book. So.
All right, Iris. As they say, I'll see you on the ocean.
That sounds good. Happy sailing.
All right, bye-bye. Take care now.
Bye.
The Joy of Cruising and Cruising Interrupted, each $16.99 plus shipping, and new release, The Joy of Cruising Again for $18.99 can be ordered at the link on thejoyofcruisingpodcast.com. For each of the 3 books, use the discount code Joy of Cruising Podcast and get $4 off. The Joy of Cruising books are also available at Amazon. Order the ebook at Amazon or your favorite online retailer. Stay in touch by joining the Joy of Cruising Podcast Facebook group or following the Joy of Cruising Podcast on Instagram. We're constantly adding new shows. Please leave a review and tell a friend about us. We hope you enjoyed this brief escape to the ocean. See you next week.